My name is Clara Bennett, and for most of my childhood, I believed I was the problem. That belief didn't begin loudly. It didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It settled quietly into my bones, whispered into the spaces between family dinners and Sunday church smiles. It lived in the way my mother's voice tightened when I entered a room. In the way my stepfather's eyes would skim past me as though I were a piece of furniture slightly out of place. It lived in the house on Wexford Lane. The house had once belonged to my grandfather, Thomas Bennett. To the outside world, it was charming: white shutters, ivy creeping up brick, a wraparound porch with a swing that creaked in the evenings. Neighbours called it "is storybook pretty." But storybooks don't tell you what happens when love turns selective. My grandfather died when I was 11. I remember the day like a photograph: rain against the hospital windows, my mother dabbing her eyes without smudging her mascara, my stepfather Richard pacing as though calculating something invisible. I was the only one holding his hand when he passed. His grip tightened once, briefly. And then it was gone. What I didn't know then was that he had already made his final decision. 2 weeks later, we gathered in a polished office that smelled of leather and lemon cleaner. The lawyer, Mr. Halpern, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. My mother, Elaine Harper, sat stiffly beside Richard. She had remarried 3 years after my father died. Richard came with polished shoes, a firm handshake, and a talent for quiet authority. And from the beginning, I never quite fit. When Mr. Halpern began reading the will, I half listened, watching dust particles float in the late afternoon light. Until I heard my name. To my granddaughter, Clara Bennett, I leave the property located at 214 Wexford Lane. The room went still. I felt it before I understood it. To be held in trust until she reaches the age of 25. My mother's fingers tightened around her purse. Richard stopped breathing. The lawyer continued calmly, explaining the terms. The house could not be sold. It could not be mortgaged. It could not be altered without trustee approval. And until I turned 25, it would remain legally mine. Mine. I was 11. I didn't even have a bank account. But I had just inherited a house. And in that moment, something shifted in the air between us. Not grief. Not pride. Something colder. We moved back into the house a month later. Not because they wanted to. Because they had to. It was a practical, my mother said. For now. Richard's smile became thinner. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Financial arguments happened behind closed doors that were never fully closed. At school, I learned to shrink. At home, I learned to disappear. Richard would stand in the doorway of my bedroom sometimes, arms folded. "You know this house costs money," he would say. "Taxes. Repairs. It's not free." I nodded, not understanding what that meant for an 11-year-old girl. My mother's disappointment felt sharper than his resentment. "If you hadn't been alone with him so much," as she once said, her voice low, "and maybe he wouldn't have made that decision." I didn't know how to answer that. Was I supposed to apologize for loving my grandfather? The resentment didn't explode. It fermented. Birthdays became obligations. Holidays became negotiations. I was reminded, subtly and not so subtly, that everything expensive in the house existed because of a decision I hadn't made. When I turned 16, Richard tried to discuss options. What if we petitioned the court? He suggested at dinner. For early transfer. For the family's benefit. The family. That word always sounded conditional when he said it. The trustee refused. My grandfather had been thorough. The real fracture came when I was 17. It was late. I was studying at the dining room table when I heard my name spoken through the kitchen doorway. She's the only obstacle, Richard was saying. My mother's voice trembled. We can't just. She's almost 18, he interrupted. Once she's legally an adult, we can pressure her. Convince her. She owes us. Owes. The word echoed. I backed away from the table slowly, heart pounding. That was the night I stopped believing I was the problem. I wasn't difficult. I wasn't selfish. I wasn't ungrateful. I was in the way. I left for college the moment I could. Not dramatically. Not with slammed doors. I packed my things quietly. I hugged my mother stiffly. Richard shook my hand like we were concluding a business arrangement. I didn't return for holidays. I didn't answer late-night calls about a financial strain. I built a life somewhere else. I worked 2 jobs. I finished school. I rented a tiny apartment with peeling paint and terrible heating, and I loved it because it was mine. When I turned 25, the trust dissolved. The house officially transferred into my sole ownership. And that's when the real war began. My mother and Richard filed a petition claiming undue influence. They argued that I had manipulated my grandfather in his final months. That I had isolated him. I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. I had been 11. The case dragged for months. Neighbors were called. Old family friends testified. Bank statements were examined. My grandfather's letters, meticulous and clear, were read aloud in court. He had anticipated this. In one letter, dated 6 months before his death, he wrote, Clara sees people for who they are. I want her to always have one place in this world where she does not have to earn her safety. The judge dismissed the case. Firmly. And publicly. Outside the courthouse, my mother didn't cry. She just looked tired. Richard didn't look at me at all. I stood in front of the house alone for the first time at 26 years old. The shutters needed repainting. The porch swing was cracked. The garden was wild. But it was still standing. I unlocked the door. Dust floated in golden beams of light. The air smelled faintly of wood and thyme. I walked through every room slowly. This house had been a battleground. But it had once been a sanctuary. And maybe it could be again. That idea didn't come fully formed. It came as a whisper. As a memory of how small and unprotected I had once felt inside those walls. And as a question. What if this house could become what it was meant to be? Not an inheritance. Not leverage. Not a weapon. But a refuge. The first night I slept in the house alone, I didn't use the master bedroom. I chose the small back room upstairs, the one with the slanted ceiling and narrow window overlooking the overgrown garden. It had been mine once. The pale yellow wallpaper had faded to something closer to bone, and the closet door still stuck if you didn't lift it slightly before pulling. The house groaned as it settled around me. Old pipes. Cooling wood. The quiet language of age. But for the first time in my life, the sounds didn't make me anxious. They made me aware. This house was no longer a battlefield. It was waiting. The inspection report arrived 3 days later. Foundation cracks. Outdated wiring. Water damage near the back porch. Termite traces in the garage beams. Richard had always complained about maintenance costs. Now I understood why. Owning something meant tending it. And tending something meant choosing not to let it decay. I stood in the living room with the contractor, a patient woman named Marisol who spoke in practical sentences and wore steel-toed boots. "You could flip it," as she said gently. "Renovate fast. Sell high. The market's good." I looked around the room. The fireplace mantel still had faint indentations where my grandfather's clock once Saturday. The staircase railing curved smoothly from decades of hands gripping it. "I'm not selling," I said. She nodded once, as if she already knew that answer. The idea came on a Wednesday afternoon. I had been sorting through boxes in the attic, old photographs, brittle holiday cards, yellowed report cards with my name written in careful penmanship. In the far corner, beneath a moth-eaten quilt, I found something unexpected. A notebook. My grandfather's handwriting filled every page. Notes about the house. Repair sketches. Garden plans. And then, near the middle, a list. Things a home must give. Safety. Warm food. A door that locks. A place to study. A place to rest without fear. Someone who listens. I sat on the attic floor, dust clinging to my jeans. He hadn't just left me a property. He had left me a philosophy. That was the moment the whisper became a plan. I didn't tell anyone at first. I researched quietly. Zoning laws. Licensing requirements. Grants for transitional housing. Trauma-informed care. Non-profit registration. At night, I drew sketches at the kitchen table. The formal dining room could become a study area. The den could become a counseling space. The upstairs guest rooms, shared bedrooms. The porch swing would stay. It wasn't about charity. It was about continuity. If I had needed one stable place when I was 17, one adult who wasn't calculating my value in dollars, I might have been different. Stronger earlier. Less afraid of my own shadow. I wanted the house to be that place for someone else. My mother found out through a mutual acquaintance. Small towns are terrible at keeping secrets. She called on a Sunday afternoon. I stared at the phone for a long time before answering. "Hello." There was a pause. "I heard you're planning something unusual," she said. Her voice had aged. Or maybe mine had changed. "I'm renovating," I replied calmly. "For what purpose?" "For young women transitioning out of unstable homes." Silence. "That house is not a shelter," as she said sharply. It's a family property. It's my property, I corrected gently. You're turning it into a statement, she snapped. Is that what this is? Revenge? I let the word hang there. No, I said. It's repair. She didn't understand that answer. I didn't expect her to. Renovation is louder than grief. Walls came down. Wiring was replaced. Floors were sanded. The air filled with sawdust and possibility. I worked alongside the crew when I could. Painting. Gardening. Stripping old wallpaper. There was something deeply satisfying about peeling away layers that had been imposed without consent. One afternoon, while scraping old paint from the porch railing, I realized something that stopped me cold. For years, I had associated this house with resentment. But resentment had never belonged to the walls. It had belonged to the people inside them. The structure itself had always been neutral. Steady. Patient. 3 months into renovations, a car pulled into the driveway. I recognized it immediately. My mother stepped out slowly. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair was more grey than blonde now. Richard was not with her. She didn't walk to the porch right away. She stood in the yard, studying the scaffolding. I climbed down the ladder carefully and wiped my hands on a rag. You could have called, I said. I tried, she replied. You don't answer much. Fair. She looked up at the house again. It looks different. It's becoming what it was meant to be. That's very poetic, she said, but there wasn't sarcasm in it. Only something tired. We stood there in the dust and late afternoon sun. Richard left, she said suddenly. The words startled me. When? A year ago. I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. He said the house had ruined everything, she continued quietly. That it divided us. I looked at her carefully. The house didn't divide us, I said. Choices did. She flinched slightly at that. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to tell her the truth. She walked toward the porch slowly. Your grandfather loved this place, as she murmured. I know. She hesitated, then added, I didn't understand why he left it to you. And now? She looked at the open doorway, the light spilling through newly cleaned windows. Now I think maybe he knew something I didn't. It wasn't an apology. But it was the closest she had ever come. The non-profit paperwork finalized in early spring. I named it Harbour Lane Initiative. The first application arrived 2 weeks later. 17 years old. Recently emancipated. No stable housing. Strong academic record. Her name was Meyer Ellis. I read her file 3 times. Then I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Richard once discussed illegal options, and felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not anger. Not grief. Purpose. The house on Wexford Lane would open its doors in 6 weeks. And for the first time since I was 11 years old, the inheritance didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. The morning Harbour Lane officially opened. I woke before sunrise. The house felt different. Not quieter. Anticipatory. I walked through each room slowly, checking details for the 100th time. Fresh sheets tucked tight. Desks cleared except for a small lamp and a notebook. Pantry stocked. Emergency numbers taped inside cabinet doors. A chore chart pinned neatly in the kitchen. I paused at the front door. For years, that door had symbolized tension. Who was coming in, who was leaving, who held power. Today, it meant invitation. At 9:12 a.m., a small silver sedan pulled into the driveway. I saw her through the window. Meyer Ellis stepped out cautiously, backpack slung over one shoulder like she might need to run at any moment. Her social worker spoke briefly to her, gesturing toward the house. Meyer nodded without smiling. I opened the door before they knocked. "Hi," I said gently. "You must be Meyer." She studied me quickly, assessing. Measuring threat level. "Yes, ma'am." "No required," I replied. "Clara is fine." She stepped onto the porch but didn't cross the threshold right away. That hesitation hit me hard. I remembered standing in the same doorway at 17, wondering whether I had a place anywhere at all. "You can come in," I said softly. "Nothing in here bites." A flicker of something, almost humor, crossed her face. She stepped inside. The first week was quiet. Meyer spoke when necessary but kept most of her thoughts guarded. She kept her backpack near her bed even at night. She flinched at loud noises. I didn't push. Safety isn't declared. It's demonstrated. We established small rituals instead. Dinner at 6:30. Study hour at 8. Porch tea on Thursdays. Grocery list meetings on Sundays. One evening, as we washed dishes side by side, she asked, "Oh, why are you doing this?" The question wasn't suspicious. It was confused. I dried my hands slowly. "Because I once needed a place like this," I said. She waited. "And because someone gave me one, even if I didn't realize it at the time." She didn't ask more. But that night, she left her backpack on the desk instead of beside the bed. Progress is often invisible to outsiders. Inside a house like this, it echoes. 2 weeks in, the first real test arrived. I came home from a supply run to find the living room window shattered. Glass glittered across the hardwood. Meyer stood frozen in the hallway. I didn't, as she started, voice shaking. I wasn't trying to. "It's okay," I said immediately, scanning her for injuries. A baseball lay near the couch. An accident. But that wasn't what had shaken her. "I'll pay for it," as she rushed out. "I swear. I'll get a job. I won't break anything else." There it was. Conditioned panic. The belief that one mistake erased belonging. I crouched to her level. "Meyer," I said carefully, "windows can be replaced." She blinked. "You're not." Her shoulders trembled slightly, like something inside her was recalibrating. We cleaned up the glass together. No lectures. No threats. Just repair. That night, She sat on the porch swing beside me. I thought you'd be angry, she admitted. I was 17 once, I said lightly. I broke much bigger things. She didn't smile. But she leaned back into the swing instead of sitting perched at the edge. By mid-spring, Harbour Lane had gained quiet attention. 2 more applications came in. A local reporter called requesting an interview. And then, my mother drove past the house 3 times in 1 week. She didn't stop. But she didn't hide, either. On the 4th pass, I stepped onto the sidewalk. She slowed. Then parked. She rolled down her window. You've painted it blue, she observed. It needed something lighter. She nodded absently. There are people talking, she said finally. There are always people talking. They think you're trying to prove something. I studied her face. Maybe I am, I said calmly. But not what they think. She looked at the porch where Meyer was reading. That girl, my mother said. Is she staying long? As long as she needs. The house was supposed to be your future. It is, I replied. She absorbed that quietly. I didn't protect you, she said suddenly. The words landed without warning. I didn't answer immediately. No, I said at last. You didn't. The honesty didn't explode. It just settled. She looked older than I had ever seen her. I thought security meant siding with the stronger person, she whispered. I was wrong. The wind moved gently through the trees. I know, I said. And this time, there was no edge in it. By early summer, Harbour Lane housed 3 young women. Dinner conversations grew louder. Laughter began to echo down the hallway. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen watching them argue over movie choices, I felt something shift deep inside me. The house no longer held ghosts. It held momentum. I stepped onto the porch alone after they went to bed. The swing creaked softly beneath me. For years, I thought inheritance meant ownership. But ownership had never been the point. Stewardship was. My grandfather hadn't given me a building. He had given me a responsibility. To make sure no child inside these walls ever felt like leverage. Or burden. Or obstacle. Behind me, through the open window, I heard Maya laugh. Not guarded. Not measured. Free. And in that sound, I realized something quietly extraordinary. The house on Wexford Lane had stopped being a reminder of what was taken. It had become proof of what could be rebuilt. By late summer, Harbour Lane was full. 4 bedrooms. 4 young women. 4 different histories stitched together under one steady roof. And for the first time since I was 11 years old, the house felt undeniably alive. Which is exactly when the challenge came. It arrived in the form of an official envelope taped to the front door. Zoning violation notice. I stood on the porch reading it twice before the words fully sank in. A formal complaint had been filed. The property, it claimed, was not approved for multi-resident transitional housing. A hearing was scheduled in 3 weeks. My hands didn't shake. But something inside me hardened. Someone wanted Harbour Lane closed. Inside, the girls were laughing in the kitchen. I folded the paper carefully and stepped back through the door, past the dining room that had once hosted tense inheritance conversations, past the staircase where I used to listen to arguments below. Not again. Not this house. Not like this. The town council meeting was packed. I stood at the front, hands folded calmly, documents organized in a neat stack. And then I saw who had filed the complaint. Richard Harper. He sat 3 rows back, posture stiff, expression unreadable. For a moment, the room tilted. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years. He looked older, thinner, but his gaze still carried that calculating sharpness. When his turn came to speak, he didn't hesitate. This property, he began smoothly, it was intended as a single-family residence. It has sentimental value to the community. Turning it into a facility changes its character. Facility. As though it were a factory. He continued, there are concerns about safety, traffic, stability. I believe this venture is emotionally driven, not responsibly structured. Emotionally driven. I almost smiled. When it was my turn, I stepped forward slowly. My name is Clara Bennett, I began. I am the legal owner of 214 Wexford Lane. I felt his eyes on me. This house has always sheltered people, I continued. It sheltered my grandfather. It sheltered my family. And now it shelters young women who would otherwise have nowhere stable to go. I held up the licensing paperwork. The safety inspections. The insurance approvals. I have complied with every regulation required by this town. A council member adjusted his glasses. The complaint suggests neighborhood disruption. I paused. Then I said something I hadn't planned. This house was once used as leverage against a child, I said evenly. Today, it is used as protection for children who have survived worse. The room went quiet. Richard shifted in his seat. I am not running a facility, I added. I am running a home. After the meeting, the council announced they would review the documents and issue a decision within 10 days. Outside, the sky hung low and grey. Richard was waiting near the courthouse steps. You've made this very public, he said flatly. You filed the complaint, I replied. You could have sold it, he snapped. Walked away clean. I did walk away, I said calmly. From you. His jaw tightened. You're doing this to spite us. No, I answered steadily. You think everything is about control. This isn't. He stepped closer. That house tore this family apart. No, I said quietly. Your greed did. The word landed clean and sharp. He looked at me like he might argue, but for once, there was no audience to perform for. You think you're better than us now, he muttered. I shook my head. I think I survived you. And for the first time, I saw something flicker behind his expression. Not anger. Not superiority. Irrelevance. The house no longer gave him power. It never had. When I returned home, I didn't mention the confrontation. But Meyer had seen the notice online. Are we getting kicked out? She asked quietly. The other girls watched me carefully. Fear spreads quickly in places built on fragile trust. I sat down at the dining table, the same table where Richard once discussed petitions to take the house from me. No, I said firmly. You are not being removed. But what if? There is no what if, I interrupted gently. This house stands. They studied my face, looking for doubt. I made sure they didn't find it. That night, after they went to bed, I walked through each room slowly. The framed rules by the staircase. The study schedules. The chipped kitchen tile that still needed replacing. This wasn't just a property dispute. This was history trying to repeat itself. And I refused to let it. 10 days later, the council delivered its ruling. Harbour Lane was compliant. The complaint was dismissed. Applause broke out in the chamber. I didn't look at Richard. I didn't need to. Outside, reporters asked for statements. I kept it simple. This house was built to shelter people, I said. We're simply honoring that purpose. 3 evenings later, there was a knock on the door. My mother stood there alone. I heard, as she said softly, about the decision. It's staying open, I replied. She nodded. I'm proud of you. The words felt unfamiliar coming from her. We stood there for a moment in the fading light. I should have fought for you, she said. Back then. Yes, I answered honestly. Tears filled her eyes, but they didn't spill. I don't expect forgiveness, she added. I'm not carrying anger anymore, I said quietly. But forgiveness takes time. She accepted that. Before leaving, she glanced inside at the hallway filled with warm light. It feels different, as she whispered. It is. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for her approval. That night, all 4 girls sat on the porch swing together, legs tangled, arguing about music. Their laughter rose into the warm air. I stood in the doorway and felt something settle fully into place. The reckoning hadn't been about the council, or Richard, or even my mother. It had been about ownership of my own narrative. The house on Wexford Lane no longer represented inheritance. It represented intention. My grandfather had once written that a home must give safety, warmth, rest, and someone who listens. Now, it did. And no complaint, no resentment, no ghost of the past could undo that. Because this time, the door belonged to me. As Harbour Lane settled into routine, a new application arrived that shook Clara more than she expected. The girl's name was Lena Ward. 17. Academic excellence. Recently removed from her home due to emotional coercion tied to financial control. The similarities were almost unbearable. When Lena arrived, she was composed, too composed. Polite. Self-sufficient. Determined not to be a burden. Clara recognized the armor immediately because she had once worn it herself. Unlike Meyer, Lena didn't flinch. She complied. Which worried Clara more. One evening, Clara found Lena asleep at her desk, refusing to rest because asleep feels unproductive. That was the moment Clara understood. Lena believed love had to be earned through performance. Harbour Lane began shifting from simple shelter into something deeper, a place that gently dismantled survival habits. Meanwhile, donations began arriving after the town council decision gained quiet media attention. A retired teacher volunteered tutoring services. A local bakery offered weekly bread deliveries. The house was growing beyond Clara. And for the first time, that didn't scare her. The crisis came unexpectedly. Maya received a call from her estranged brother. The conversation ended with her locked in the bathroom, spiraling into panic. Old trauma resurfaced fast. The other girls were frightened. Lena withdrew further. The fragile ecosystem inside the house trembled. Clara faced her first real fear. What if love and stability weren't enough? That night, instead of trying to affix a Maya, Clara sat on the bathroom floor outside the locked door and simply stayed. "I'm not going anywhere," as she said quietly. No lectures. No solutions. Just presence. Hours later, the door opened. Maya didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. But the next morning, she joined breakfast again. And Lena, watching this, began to soften. Harbour Lane survived its first emotional storm. Not because it was perfect, but because it held. Over the next year, something extraordinary unfolded. Maya applied to university and got in. Lena began painting murals in the upstairs hallway. The walls, once heavy with silence, now bloomed with color. The youngest resident, Tessa, started calling Clara a Miss Seer with affectionate sarcasm. Clara's mother began volunteering quietly on Saturdays, organizing pantry shelves without asking for recognition. It wasn't redemption, but it was effort. One afternoon, Clara found her mother sitting on the porch swing. "You built what I couldn't," her mother admitted. Clara didn't respond with accusation this time. "We build from what we survive," as she said gently. And that was enough. 5 years after Harbour Lane opened, the house looked brighter than ever. The shutters were freshly painted. The garden overflowed with flowers planted by former residents who came back to visit. A small plaque now hung near the door. A home must offer safety, warmth, rest, and someone who listens. Thomas Bennett. At the anniversary gathering, former residents filled the living room with stories of apartments, scholarships, first jobs, healthy relationships. Maya hugged Clara tightly before leaving for graduate school. "You didn't save me," as she said. "You gave me space to save myself." That was the point. Later that evening, Clara stood alone on the porch. The house no longer carried echoes of resentment. Only resilience. Her inheritance had never been about ownership. It had been about interruption, stopping a cycle before it could continue. Inside, laughter rose again. And this time, it didn't feel fragile. It felt permanent.